before sunrise on a mild summer morning in June 1995. A 27-year-old television news anchor named Jodi Huisentruit hurriedly left her apartment in Mason City, Iowa, headed for work. But she never arrived, and her disappearance has never been solved. In 2003, two television news reporters created FindJodi.com, a website dedicated to preserving Jodi's memory and keeping her case alive. This is the official Find Jodi podcast. Welcome back to the Find Jodi podcast. I'm Scott Fuller. What kind of person would have abducted and likely murdered TV news anchor Jodi Huisentruit on the morning of June 27, 1995? As you know from television and movies, there's an entire segment of the FBI dedicated to answering questions like that. The Behavioral Analysis Unit, or BAU, contains agents who are certified criminal profilers, and their role is to provide investigators all over the country an additional resource to help determine who an offender might be in the abstract. They analyze crime scenes, victims, and other factors to try to point police investigators who are working on these cases in the right direction to search for the identity of uncaught violent criminals. On this episode of the podcast, Caroline Lowe and I spoke with a retired certified FBI profiler named Julia Cowley, who worked at the FBI for 22 years and worked at the BAU from 2009 until her retirement in 2021. This is a longer than normal episode of the podcast, but we think you'll find Julia's insight of Jodi's case, even from the outside as someone who did not work on Jodi's case for the FBI, valuable throughout the episode. And for those of you who are procedural true crime listeners like us, who are fascinated with the process of how these crimes are committed and solved, we hope it will be worth your time. Our conversation with retired FBI profiler Julia Cowley is coming up next.
Profiling is just based on the fact that traits and characteristics of an individual are generally reflected in their repeated patterns of behavior. And that these traits and characteristics, they remain consistent, whether it concerns like their normal life, their normal everyday life, or the commission of a crime. And that's sort of the concept of profiling. And Caroline, I know you've heard our podcast, and we talk about profiling concepts. And one of the things that I always bring up as an example is that I'm early everywhere I go, and to the point where I can inconvenience other people, I inconvenience myself. I will set 3 alarm clocks if I have somewhere I need to be early morning because I'm afraid I'm not going to wake up. And I even have my husband set one of the alarm clocks in case I've made a mistake. So, what can you determine about my personality based on that repeated pattern of behavior that I have? And you could say I'm conscientious. That would be a nice way. Or you say, well, maybe you're anxious. You don't want to miss out on anything. You're a control freak, all of these things. So, and those are all probably true. If you ask people that know me, I mean, my husband once said, you micromanage the kitchen. So I have to have control over certain things. So if I were going to go commit a crime, I'm going to be a very organized individual. I'm going to plan. I'm going to have, a plan of attack. I'm going to have my weapons ready. I'm going to take a weapon to the scene. I'm going to bring it from the scene. I'm going to wear gloves. I'm going to be prepared. And so that's how we look at cases. Okay, what in the way that an offender commits a crime, what does that tell us about that offender? And what are their real personality traits and characteristics? And that's the basis of it. As you can see, it's in no way an exact science, and it's certainly not a psychological diagnosis. Some of the personality traits and characteristics may be in line with certain personality disorders, but our role is not to diagnose anyone. It's really just to say, this is the kind of person that you're looking for. And In some cases, it can help focus the investigation in the direction of the most probable offender. So that's the idea behind profiling. And in terms of an investigation, I think behavior often gets overlooked, and it's kind of a last resort. Okay, let's go back and examine the behavior as carefully as we can. But of course, in terms of forensics and the investigative work, those are the two most important things. And then the behavior is kind of the third most important thing. But understanding the behavior can really help. It can help in helping to solve the case. It can help provide a better understanding of the offense, including the motivation of the offender. It can help explain the victim selection process and the crime scene dynamics. So, and then of course, understanding your offender may also help you when you want to do an interview of that offender.
So would you, if say a local agency reached out to you to give your insight, would you help them in how they ask questions of a person they might be interviewing, whether it's the witnesses, a person of interest? What would you help them on that way?
Oh, definitely. That was one of the services that we provided in the behavioral analysis unit, where they do have a suspect or the investigation has identified an individual and they're going to arrest that individual. So they want to try to elicit a confession. So how do you approach that person? And everyone's different. There's no one way to do an interrogation. So what are the themes that might work for a person, and how to deal with them when they're not answering your questions or giving you what you want. Like, for example, in one particular interview, and this was not related to Jodi DeAngelo, not this case, it was a different case, but we knew that the offender was likely going to make up perhaps mental health issues and maybe say they dreamt the crime or something like that, because based on other interactions that people had with him, and he'd had contact with law enforcement on another matter. So we thought this is likely something he'll try to throw out there. And I think the instinct would be argue with the person about it. And in this case, we thought that would be detrimental. So we said, just let him talk about it. Just go with it. Let him talk about what he's seeing. And if if things sound implausible, don't question him on it and don't get into an argument. And that worked really well. And while this confession wasn't perfect, he seemed to describe the victims as monsters, not real people. But what he did do is, when he described what happened with these monsters, he laid out the perfect sequence of events that only the offender would have known. He knew what gun was used at what time. He knew how the victims were found. And so that's something only the offender would know. So it really ended up being a very productive interview by just letting him, make it seem like he had some sort of mental health issue or he was out of touch with reality, but he was not. And then ultimately they connected forensic evidence and were able to get a conviction. So that's like an example of a potential strategy with an offender.
One thing you mentioned, one of your colleagues mentioned in your podcast, is that sometimes, because you see so many cases where a small department may see something that's so unusual, you might be able to connect the dots or see whether there's linkage to another one or have some insight. Can you kind of share how seeing so many horrific crimes as you have and study them, how that might help you with a department that's not used to seeing an unusual case?
Yeah, I think because the behavioral analysis unit, in our role, we see so many different types and very unusual cases. And like you said, Caroline, some of these smaller departments, this will be the only case that they have like this in their entire careers. They're a very low crime area, but because we've seen so many and we can provide information about what helped solve that other crime and provide them some strategies that may lead to them solving the case. And I think it also helps if you're looking at one case, you say, okay, I have seen that before, and this is what it turned out to be. So you might want to consider this other potential, outcome because sometimes I think people can get really focused on one thing and maybe don't consider other things. But if we've seen it in the behavioral analysis unit, we can say, hey, this is very similar to what you're saying, and this is what the outcome was. And so that's also helpful, having seen so many different types of cases. And, we saw a lot of really unusual cases, but we saw a lot of other cases that they're I don't want to say regular cases, but they're typical violent crime cases. But some of these departments don't have violent crime like that in the areas in their territories. So they may never have seen something like that. And some of these cases, they can just go cold, and it's no fault of the investigators. It's just, and sometimes it's just the offender gets lucky. So just having another set of eyes look at these cases can be really helpful.
Well, I think this would be a good time if we could talk with you about Jodi's case. And I know that you've never had direct access to any FBI or police files on Jodi Huisentruit's case, but you have studied it quite a bit. You have followed a lot of news reports. And I wonder if you could start off by just giving us some overall impressions from maybe starting with the scene, what you see, and walk us through what you think from where you are is likely to have happened.
Sure. I appreciate that, Caroline, because I haven't looked at the case, and I have seen media reports, and I have seen what the police department, the investigators have talked about publicly. So I'm going to try to be really general when I talk, because I tend to make it a practice that I'm not going to do an analysis first and foremost all by myself without colleagues, but without knowing exactly what the investigation is and what the investigators know, because I would miss something. If I had tried to profile Jodi DeAngelo without talking to the investigators and just going off the media, I would have been wrong. I would have had a different impression of him. So I'm going to just talk generally. And in terms of, looking at this case and Jodi's abduction, a couple of things that I would want to focus on is, okay, exactly what happened at the crime scene? And that's how I always start. Everybody has their own process. Okay, what happened here? And then the next thing I want to know is the victimology, which is like a complete picture of a crime victim. And so in terms of the crime scene itself, I think there's enough information out there that I can safely say that this was somewhat of a blitz attack. And, my understanding is her car was very close to the door she would have exited out of her apartment building. And so someone was there prepared to grab her very quickly and immediately and take her. So that's what I see based on what has been, available to the public. So a blitz attack. And I see this as somebody that had a plan in place already. So the offender knew what he was going to do with her. And I'm going to say he, because statistically it's most likely a male. So we'll just call him he. And had a plan in place, knew what he was going to do with her, where he was going to take her. I think that if the person hadn't planned to abduct her, let's say the person had gone there to try to have a conversation with her and things escalated, and then, he felt he had to take her for some reason, I think that becomes less plausible, because you have, more interaction between them, perhaps more yelling, more screaming, voices getting raised. And so more likely that somebody's going to hear something. And I do understand that maybe victims heard something, but it wasn't enough and it wasn't prolonged enough that anyone got up and they were, looking out the window or decided to call the police. So it's kind of one of those things. Sometimes you think you hear something, or like, I think I heard a scream, or I think maybe I heard a gunshot, but it wasn't prolonged enough or didn't become loud enough that it drew anybody's attention for any length of time. And then you also have to think about the fact that if this person didn't go there with a plan to abduct her, then, his car, it's not parked and readily available to put her right in the car. So again, that prolongs the interaction between the offender and Jodi. And it, again, increases the risk that someone's going to hear something, someone's going to, maybe look out their window, and then he's got to get her in to his vehicle. So he's got to grab or open the door. Again, all this becomes a lot more prolonged, and it becomes, in my mind, a little less plausible that this wasn't planned out in advance. So that's what I see. I see somebody who had formulated a plan, planned to grab her, and did it very quickly, very effectively and efficiently. And although Jodi was small in stature, to grab somebody, to go grab another human being, no matter how big and strong you are, that's really risky and requires I don't want to say someone to be brave, but someone who's confident in their ability to go grab and control someone and get them immediately controlled and immediately away from the abduction site. And so the person's probably very confident in their physical abilities. And I would suspect that someone who's capable of doing that has likely put their hands on someone before. So used to having grabbed and perhaps controlled somebody before in some kind of fashion. And like you said, Caroline, I always say most likely. So, but that's what I see. I see somebody extremely physically confident in their abilities. Even though she was small in stature, it's still, most people who don't have that mindset couldn't even dream of like grabbing and putting their hands on somebody in that way. So this is, this is a huge part of his personality, I think, his physical confidence in his ability.
So you don't think it's likely that it could be somebody who went there to have a conversation or there was a confrontation? You think this was planned? The abduction was the purpose of being there?
Yep. And as I said, I would say I think that's most likely the scenario. However, just because it becomes less plausible to me that this person, more people didn't hear things and there's prolonged and it just happened so quickly. I mean, she's there 1 minute and then she's gone. And so, yeah, that just seems like the most likely scenario to me. So let's say we go with the scenario that somebody went there to confront her and things go wrong. So they grab her. And so, then you're looking at somebody who is impulsive, slightly more impulsive than somebody who's planned out. And again, you're likely to see this kind of behavior. And let's go to her victimology, because this sort of goes into her victimology. And I don't know every little detail about her, but what I do know is that I would classify her as a high-risk victim, and that was not because she's involved in any criminal activity or seemed to associate with, criminals or people involved in criminal activity, but because of her position as a in the media as a newscaster. So, and then also just her lack of security. She's not very security conscious in term, at least back then. I mean, her address was listed, so she really becomes high risk, and she has contact with so many people in a way that normal people that aren't in the media don't. She's coming into contact with all these different people who might want to do her harm. So I would classify her based on those two things as a high risk victim. So, and then in terms of her victimology, you'd want to look at her personal life. And I don't know a lot about her personal life, but what I would be looking for, did she have risk? Was she involved in relationships that put her at risk? And then I would start to look, okay, maybe her risk does come from her personal life. But from my perspective, her number one risk was the fact it came from her position in the media and the fact that she wasn't very security conscious. So in terms of, did someone go there to try to talk to her and have a conversation with her? Well, that just goes back to her victimology. Who would want to do that and why? So what was going on in her personal life? And was she involved in relationships that were causing her problems? And is she the type of person, if she was, would she be telling people about that? I understand she had kept a diary. Was she writing about these things in her diary? So you really want to focus on, okay, in her personal life, not her professional life. Okay, where is she at risk? And I don't think I know enough to be able to say, okay, she was at risk because of this relationship or that relationship, or she engaged in this kind of activity. So I don't think I know enough, but if somebody went to confront her, I would think it was somebody that she had more of a close personal connection with. And that person would probably stand out as somebody that she had concerns with.
That should have shown up in her diary or conversations with her friends. Where would you look for that?
Yeah, I would definitely look for that. But I would also, I mean, again, we have to go back to who was she? Did she share this kind of information with people? Is she the type of person if she had an issue, did she keep it completely to herself, or was she open and did she have people and friends and confidants that she would share with? So she, if she's not a person who shares easily, you might not see it in her diary. She might not have told anybody, but that goes to her victimology. That's something you'd want to know. If she had an issue, did she have a friend she called immediately? I know I do. So, I mean, I take the time if I'm going through something, I talk to people around me, and people pretty much know what's going on with me. But was she that kind of person? I think that's what we have to look at. And if she was, then yes, I would expect to see that would be in her diary, or she would have told her friends or family members or people that she confided with, this is causing me distress, and this is upsetting to me, or this person is bothering me or scaring me. From the outside looking in, she seems like although she comes across as very sweet and innocent, I guess, in a way. She, if you look at what she was doing with her career and her life, she was really very independent, and I think maybe a lot more, I don't want to say savvy, but a lot more worldly than maybe people give her credit for. I mean, she was, she was moved and took this job and lived alone and lived a pretty independent life. She had engaging in a lot of different activities. She was an athlete. I understand she was an avid golfer. So, looks could be deceiving, but I think she was a very confident woman. So, is that the type of woman that's going to put up with a lot of nonsense in her life? I don't know, but I don't think so. And she was looking to move into a bigger market, and she had like just these wonderful aspirations to be on, the national news. And so she was very, driven. And I don't think she would put up with much or let anyone stand in her way. She didn't seem that way. But again, I don't know all her victimology. I don't know what her family would say, but that's sort of how I look at it, viewing her from, outside, from the outside, what she had done with her life, not so much how she maybe came across on TV. I mean, you kind of have to be a certain way when you're delivering the nightly news to, you have to be likable and approachable. And this is, you're going into people's homes every night, and they want to feel that they know you and they're familiar with you. And so she has to have this persona on TV, but she was, very worldly in some ways, very independent and very strong.
What do you see as the significance, if there is any, of the fact that it was a Tuesday morning? Tuesday morning as she's going to work. Why then? Why the location? What things jump out for you on that?
Well, I mean, I don't know why a Tuesday morning. It could very well be it's just the offender, that's just the day he had available, or that was the day he decided that this was going to happen. I don't know. However, in terms of her vulnerability, it would seem that would be the most opportune time for someone to confront her or attack her, because she was alone. She lived alone. She was going to work. It was quiet. It was dark. Most people are not up at that time. And it sounded like when she was not at her apartment, she was very busy, and she had contact with a lot of people, community members, her people that she worked with, her friends. She had a very active social life. She had just had a lot of friends, and she was very busy. So I just see this as, in terms of her victimology, the most opportune time to go and abduct her, because she's at her most vulnerable. That's how I view it. Why Tuesday worked out for the offender, or that was the day that he decided that this was going to happen, I don't know for sure. I don't know if I can say it has any significance that I see, other than it just, the stars aligned that day.
Do you think it's likely the person worked a third shift schedule, or anything about the abductor that would relate to the day, or is it more focused on when Jodi was most available?
Well, certainly during that time, the offender, it was, likely he's not accountable to anyone. So whether he lived alone or he made an excuse to a family member or his place of employment, I don't know. I mean, it could be that he didn't show up for work that day. I don't really think that I would know enough to be able to comment on that specifically, like what his shift would have been. But clearly at that time, it's unlikely that somebody realizes he's gone. He's probably made some sort of excuse, or he doesn't live with anybody and had nowhere to be.
Do you think it's likely he went there before, that this was planned? There had been some stalking or researching Jodi to figure out the patterns, planned to do it, and decided not to do it on a certain day?
I do. I would think that it would be really high risk for someone who's never been to that area or been to her apartment and how lucky he was to get her at that very time. So yeah, I do think it's very likely that the person was familiar with the area, familiar with her apartment building. it is quite possible that anyone could figure out her schedule based on the time that she was on air. Say, okay, she must have to get there pretty early. Look in the phone book. Here's where she lives. I'm going to go over there and see if I can catch her. And they do it. I mean, that could have happened as well. Is that as likely to me? No. I think it's somebody who had been there before, had surveilled the area. My understanding is that the apartment door, so correct me if I'm wrong, the apartments are inside. The doors to the apartments are inside. They're not outside, correct?
Correct.
So you have like one main entrance. So, and that door was not locked. So the offender could have even have gone in at some point at any time of day. I don't know if it was locked at night or not, but at any point in time could have gone in and determined exactly her apartment and where it was located in the building. And he would have been able to see, okay, the lights go on at this time and they go off at this time. And if they had done any kind of surveillance, it wouldn't really take very long to establish her patterns. Not long at all. Maybe one time prior would be good enough to establish what her pattern is, because they already would know that she's on air at this time every day during the week, or they would know that. So they know she has to have some sort of pattern. And that's, kind of what might have elevated her risk, is that you could put her at a place at the same time on certain days all the time. She was always going to be at the station at this time every day during the week. And so therefore you can infer that she's getting up at the same time. And it sounds like that was not always the case. Sometimes she would run a little late, but never missed a day of work despite running late on occasion. But, she's has her routines, and that routine may also have elevated her risk were, someone out there looking to harm her.
Was the fact that she was running late, she was close to an hour late for work, is that significant in any way? Does it tell you anything about who would wait that long since she wasn't leaving at her typical time?
I guess I could sort of, let me just talk this through. So someone's there and they let's say they've surveilled her before, and I'm just talking kind of hypothetically because I don't know, and I'm kind of talk generally, but they've surveilled her before and they know she usually leaves an hour earlier and she's not getting up. They don't see the light on and they're waiting. So, I mean, I guess what that tells me is if somebody is waiting for her and she's running an hour late, this was a day that they were available to do this. And they had the time frame, because at some point that person's not going to be able to do it. It's going to get too light. It's going to get too crowded. People are going to start waking up and they're going to leave. But this person probably had it set in their mind that here's my time frame that I have, and I have the availability to be here and to do this. So that's more what that tells me, that they were, willing to wait and they had the ability to wait. If they had in fact watched her prior, they would know that she was running late. But I don't think I can draw any other significance to that without even knowing more. And even if I did know more, I'm not sure that I could.
Okay, if we could talk a little more about the scene, particularly with your forensic background. There was no blood. Does that tell you anything in terms of the lack of blood at a scene for something that's a very violent attack? Also, a lot of Jodi's items were left behind. The abductor didn't scoop up anything to take it with him. What does that tell you from your experience?
Well, certainly with the lack of blood, to me, that just indicates, okay, it happened quickly and with no significant injuries that would cause bleeding. And the longer you're there and the more that there's a struggle, the more likely you are to have injuries and potential blood left at the scene. It doesn't mean she wasn't injured at all. It just means or she could have had an injury and a cut, and the blood just didn't get on anything but her or the offender. So it does tell me, okay, it happened quickly. It's interesting that all her belongings are left there, because when the police show up, they immediately know something's wrong. I mean, there's no hiding that something is terribly wrong. It's not like, oh, maybe she just went off with somebody, or maybe she disappeared, or and you don't know that foul play has occurred. It was obvious foul play had occurred. So that tells me that the offender perhaps wasn't concerned that this scene was viewed as it really was, which was a violent abduction. They didn't care that police would be notified, because the offender would have to know that if she doesn't show up to work, that he's got a short time frame before somebody realizes something is wrong. This tells me that perhaps the offender didn't have a concern that anyone could connect this to him. He's like, okay, if they see that this is a violent abduction, I don't have a known relationship to her, so they're not going to know it's me. In cases, and I'll talk generally about staging, in cases where we see staging, which is when an offender alters the crime scene to make it look like something that it's not. And the reason that they do this, well, first I'll give an example, like somebody, kills their significant other in the house, and then they make it look like somebody, came in to, burglarize the place, and it was a burglary gone bad, and were confronted. And so that would be an example of staging. And the reason why an offender would stage a crime scene is because it is their perception that if the crime or the crime scene is viewed as what it actually is, if it's left as, and the police know what actually happened, that they know they will be prioritized as the number one suspect. So they feel they have to alter the scene. And altering the scene requires that you spend more time at the scene. It's high risk to the offender, but the offender believes that the risks is worth it. And so what we don't see is staging. And, lack of staging doesn't necessarily mean, okay, this person had no relationship with her or was not known to her. But it's a consideration to think of, okay, the scene was left as it is. It was immediately, once the police arrived, it was immediately identified as a violent abduction. The police were there right away. Everybody knew there was something wrong. And so the offender, by not spending time, perhaps just didn't think this would be connected to him. That's the best I can give. And it's a very general kind of assessment. But just because you don't have staging, that does not mean that it's not a close personal relationship.
Do you think the offender is likely to have done a crime like this before and has done a similar crime since then? Is that something that jumps out that way to you?
In the past, I would say, yeah, probably. But I've seen some strange things, and I worked on a case where a young woman was abducted, kind of similar, I don't want to say similar circumstances, but she was abducted from her place of employment, and her body was found in a wooded area a couple miles, and it was found several days later, and she had been sexually assaulted and killed. So when he was identified and arrested, and they had DNA in that case, the police, when the investigators looked into his background, he had no criminal history that either before the homicide or after the homicide. So, and they can't find anything. It really does appear this might be the only crime he committed. And this is back in 1992. And I believe he was 24 at the time, but, early to mid 20s when he committed this crime. So, in that case, I would have thought the offender likely would have had a criminal history. And that is most likely the case in most violent cases like this. But because I saw that, I'm always a little hesitant to say, but so I just put that out there to just let people know that just because somebody does something like really horrific, you may not actually have any other related crimes. I mean, there's this myth about people who kill other people or kill strangers, and okay, they can't stop. There's a compulsion. That's not true. There are several cases that the offender kills once and they don't do it again, and they haven't done it before. However, I would think that an individual who does something like this is most likely to have some sort of violent criminal history before and after. Yes, that would be the most likely scenario, in my opinion, is you have something there, and not necessarily murder, but probably physical abuse of some sort. I mean, this is a person who's comfortable with putting his hands on another individual. They're comfortable with that. So I would expect to see some sort of history.
What about the crime scene itself? Given your forensic background, we understand their red heels, their earrings, a blow dryer, some items like that. What value could you see forensically today, perhaps, of being tested for something that might lead us to Jodi's abductor?
I'm sure the investigators and people in the laboratory have evaluated the possibility of what they can get from these items in terms of forensic evidence. And what I will say is that as sampling and testing becomes more sensitive, we're more likely to get forensic evidence such as DNA that may be unrelated to the scene. And not only that, you're dealing with really small samples. So the lab, perhaps, and this has happened in other cases where you hold on, because if you test what's left, you consume it all, and then you can never test it in the future. It's gone. So perhaps there's something there, or they don't want to use up the sample and they're waiting for technology to advance until they can. So those are sort of the things that I would be thinking about in terms of the evidence. I am sure every piece has been evaluated, and what can we get from this, and do we want to try to do that now and take that risk, or do we want to wait until maybe there's an advancement? And then again, will it be useful in terms of, in investigative leads? Because like I said, as things become we can, start sampling smaller and smaller amounts and testing smaller and smaller amounts. That evidence, that DNA, may not be related. It's more likely, becomes more likely that it may just be some contamination of some sort, or something that is completely unrelated to the crime. Back in the old day, you had to have a lot of blood to test for DNA. And so you knew this is part of the crime scene. We don't have those assurances anymore. And you kind of have to take that evidence that you've tested and the results that you get and put it into the context of the investigation and evaluate it that way, as opposed to, yep, this is definitely blood, and there's a bloody fingerprint here and that, so that has to be the offender. It's not like that with these smaller samples, but there is a possibility. There is something out there, some DNA that could potentially be tested. But in terms of, and I never want to say, okay, never, it's going to be impossible, because I saw some impossible things done. I've collected evidence that I thought they'll never get a DNA result off of this piece of evidence, and sure enough they did. So I don't want to say never, but in terms of how quickly this crime happened, the likelihood that the offender left a significant amount of DNA, or any DNA, is pretty slim.
We've heard a lot about a partial palm print on the car, a hair. We don't know if it has a root. And also a toilet seat may have been left up and was found left up in Jodi's apartment. Just if you could comment on some of your impressions of how significant would any of those seem to be to you.
I mean, again, it would have to be evaluated in the context of the case. Like a palm print, that's great evidence. But I don't think you can include, I don't think you can exclude anyone just because their palm print doesn't match. I don't think you can do that because that palm print could belong to anyone. And so you have to evaluate the actual scene. So I don't think they can conclusively say that palm print is the offender's palm print. In terms of trying to determine if it is related, I mean, you're going to have to look at, is this a person that should have been there or could have been there? Or, if they match that palm print to somebody who, lived, one town over who was a sex offender and that palm print is on her car, then, hey, that's a pretty good lead. So, but if you match it to a friend of hers or, somebody who worked at a car dealership or whatever, then it becomes less relevant. Yeah, they could be her killer, but there's also a good explanation. You have to decide, okay, what's the explanation of how this got here? And, is there a plausible reason that somebody could have left their palm print? It's a great piece of evidence. It can be used to identify a person, but is it going to, exclude or include, conclusively a suspect? I don't think it can be used in that manner. I think it's, it would be one piece of the puzzle. And in terms of DNA, that again, I never like to say, oh, it's impossible, because I've seen impossible things happen. But, I am assuming that this print was dusted and lifted with tape and then placed on some sort of card. That's how we did it when I was in the crime lab. That's, how we do it now. Often when we collect fingerprints, we dust and lift and put the tape on a card. And so trying to get DNA from that would be difficult because studies have shown that latent print powder may destroy the biological material. So I think there's been some studies that have shown that. So in terms of trying to get DNA from the palm print, I'm not sure that that would even be possible. But you'd have to talk to somebody who's in the lab doing DNA analysis, because that wasn't my expertise.
What about the hair? There's one hair at the scene and we don't know if it had a root or not.
Well, in terms of testing, we used to have the root ball because that's where the DNA, but now there can be identifications made without the root. So, but again, you have to look at that evidence in context of the investigation. And is there a plausible explanation why a certain person's hair might be there, if it's ever linked to somebody? Or is it linked to an individual who really shouldn't have been there? The other thing is that, when you're looking at the evidence, if you were to identify, okay, this palm print and the hair belongs to the same individual, that's pretty good. That's when I'd start to say, okay, this might be related. This isn't just contamination, or this wasn't left and it's unrelated to the crime scene. That's when you have, okay, if you can match the two, okay, the palm print and the hair belongs to the same individual, I would say, oh, you might be onto something there. But again, hair is so fragile, and it's easy. It's perishable. It can blow away. And so I don't know where the hair was found. And so it's hard to say, is it related to the actual abduction, or was it just something they found on the ground somewhere close? I'm not really sure, if the police believe it's actually related, or it's just they collected everything that was in the area.
And the toilet seat being up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that one.
That's okay. Anything significant would you find that the toilet seat was up?
you need to have that document. You'd have to know for a fact that that's how it was found and nobody else had been in that apartment. And then I would think, okay, that's unusual. Most women who live alone would not leave a toilet seat up. So you want to make sure, like in terms of the scene and people going into the scene, is that really how it was found, and it was not disturbed. So I have heard other people talk about this toilet seat, and I will tell you that I have seen people, investigators, use the bathroom at crime scenes. I've seen it. I mean, not like I wasn't in the bathroom, so no, but people have done that. And it wasn't my practice, and usually in the teams that I was on, that was not our practice. However, there have been times where investigators have used the bathroom. So to say that never happens, that is not true. It does happen. I have seen it happen in the past, and so did that happen? And then somebody just doesn't know or doesn't want to admit they used the bathroom when they were there. But it's really important, and generally when you're processing a scene, is that you take really good detailed entry and exit logs of who goes into the crime scene and when they go in and when they exit. And that was something we always did meticulously. Who's in here and how long are they in there and when do they leave? And so you can eliminate any potential contamination of the scene or things like that. Hey, did you use the toilet? Did you put the toilet seat up? Did you touch this? Because this isn't in the position that we would expect it to be in. So there needs to be a really comprehensive log of who enters and exits the crime scene. So, I mean, in terms of it being, I don't know how the scene was preserved. I don't know who processed it or how many people were in prior to them saying, okay, this is now a crime scene. No one can come in. I mean, we just don't know. And, and I've been at scenes and I've processed scenes where there was contamination. And when we would finish up, we'd, take samples of everyone's boots in case there were, shoe tracks and people needed to be eliminated and things like that we would do, just standard, so that we would know, okay, this isn't part of the crime scene. This was one of the officers that was, first on scene. So we do stuff like that just in case.
How significant to the investigation, or would you think the fact that Jodi made a stalking report about 8 months before she disappeared, that somebody in a white truck had been following her, is something that concerned her enough to report it to police? Would that be something you would spend much time on if you were trying to figure out who took Jodi?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's significant. I think that has to be vetted as thoroughly as possible. And there may not be enough information for them to have vetted that out if it's, the description is vague, or the vehicle she described is very common, and that can make it really difficult. But yeah, I think that is important and it's significant. It becomes, because she's a public figure, it's maybe more common for somebody like her. If she was not a public figure, I would say that it would be more, more significant for someone who was a private citizen, not a public figure. So, but yeah, I think that's important. The other thing that tells us is that she's aware of her surroundings. She knows that there's a problem and she'll report it. She's like, okay, this is unusual. This doesn't make me comfortable. So that it gives us a little insight into Jodi's mindset. She's certainly not oblivious to potential issues. I don't really see that she is someone who's going to make a mountain out of a molehill. So this was concerning enough for her to report it. So that just tells me she's a vigilant person. She's aware of her surroundings. If she's uncomfortable, she's going to say something. That's just a little insight maybe into her victimology that I would pick up on based on her report to the police about that.
If you and your team were back at the BAU and you were assigned to Jodi's case tomorrow, just walk us through some of the things you would do, and who would you attempt to interview or re-interview? Who would you consider key people that you'd want interviewed? I realize you don't interview the people in the field.
Correct.
Some of the people you would want interviewed or re-interviewed.
The first thing we would do, I mean, and again, in my process, I'd want to make sure I truly understood, the crime scene itself, and that I had viewed every photograph that had been taken and every notation that the crime scene investigators had taken. I'd want to see all their notes, because there might be something in there that's like, oh, that's interesting. So that's something. But in terms of really looking at this case, what I would want is to see would be thorough questionnaires, like a thorough victimology done on Jodi. And I'm speaking hypothetically. I don't know that this hasn't been done. So I'm just saying what I would do if this hadn't been done. I would say, okay, here. So we had these, what we call general assessment questionnaires, and they're about 35 pages. And we would use the questionnaires to sort of get a personality profile of an individual, whether it was a victim, whether it was a suspect, whether it was a witness that needed to be interviewed and we thought they might not be cooperative. We want to just have a really good understanding of that individual. And it's a very thorough questionnaire, and it's also very invasive. So, I mean, we want to know everything about very personal things in it, about the individual. So I would want those given to people that were close to Jodi, that knew her well and knew her in different aspects of her life, because we're all kind of different. We're different in our professional lives. We're different in our personal lives. And so maybe sort of take a representation of the different factions of her life and have some people fill out these questionnaires. And that'll help us get a really good understanding of Jodi's personality, how she deals with conflict, how she deals with problems, if she had concerns, if, potentially where risks might be, where she might have risk in her life. So and those can be very useful. And I think oftentimes that's something in an investigation that gets overlooked, because a lot of times it's not needed. If you have the forensics and you've got your witnesses and things, you don't necessarily need to do this really comprehensive deep dive into a victim. But I think that would be really interesting to see, like, how would she deal with a potential relationship that she didn't want to be in, or how would she deal with a relationship or with somebody who made her uncomfortable in any way? Would she tell somebody? So those are things that I would want to know about her, because if she's not the type of person that's going to tell anybody, there may be somebody in her life that the investigators can't identify as a risk because she didn't tell anybody. And so I would say, yeah, you probably do need to examine her, her inner circle, or the people she had contact with a little more closely, because she wouldn't have necessarily told anybody that she was uncomfortable or she was having problems. And the other thing that I would want to do is any suspects that they were to develop, do deep dives on them, like the same questionnaire. You can apply kind of the same questions to this person, to any potential suspects, and see are they the type of person that would do something like this. And I'll just give an example. So let's say they believe, or I'm going to give a hypothetical, not a real example. They believe that this is somebody that is close to her. And you presented a scenario, Caroline, of, well, let's say somebody wanted to go confront her about something that happened and things went wrong, and he grabbed her. Well, what I would want to know about that person or people in her lives is that how they react? Are they somebody that, when there's a problem, they react immediately? Or is this somebody who ruminates for a while and then acts? Or are they impulsive? So I would want to know those things about the person. And to see how they would behave in a certain situation. And then, as you're kind of going through, you might say, well, this person seems more likely to be the type of person that would react in this way versus this person. And so it kind of helps, prioritize people. Like maybe you should, focus on this person as, the prioritized suspect until you can rule that person out. And then maybe this person next. But you really want to see like how these people would react. But I don't really, it really just doesn't make sense to me that somebody went to confront her. It really does seem like this was a planned crime. And so if it is someone close to her, I would expect that this is the kind of person who doesn't react immediately when they're angry or upset. They give it time, and they can kind of hold off and then seek revenge at a later time. And so those are kind of the characteristics and the behavior you'd want to see. They're not somebody who's just going to fly off the handle and it's over. They're going to wait and exact revenge at a later time, and they can kind of postpone that. So that's what I would expect to see if it was someone who was maybe known to Jodi.
Do you lean toward more of a stranger abduction based on what you described at the scene? Or
I have to say again, I don't know what the investigators have. However, from my viewpoint, which isn't in any way intimate in the investigation, from my viewpoint, it does appear more to be, and this is based on where I see her risk level. And of course, I don't know everything about her lifestyle, and the crime scene dynamics themselves, the crime scene itself. I see this more of a potential to be that this is somebody that was an unknown relationship. That this was not a known relationship to other people, and including Jodi. Jodi may have run into this person before. Maybe she knew who they were, but it wasn't a known close personal relationship that can be identified. That's how I view it from a very, very distant look. So, but, I can't say really more than that. I'm sure that, if I were to see the investigation, I'd be able to be more conclusive in my opinion. But even if I were to offer opinion or my team would offer an opinion, it would see more likely than not.
Got it.
So, yeah, I mean, in terms of it being somebody like close to her and or somebody who went to confront her, you would expect to see some sort of buildup. And again, I don't know if this is part of the investigation and this has all been documented and detailed by investigators, but some sort of escalation. And if somebody, like, let's say this is somebody who wants to have a romantic relationship with Jodi, and she doesn't want to be in the romantic relationship, well, you'd expect to see like kind of a buildup, like maybe some confrontations between them, like why Jodi, why, and no, I'm just not interested, and phone calls and potentially repeated phone calls, attempts to try to get her to be interested in him, and when all else fails, then he resorts to this. But you would see some sort of escalation. And based on the fact that she reported potentially being stalked, I just don't really see her as a person, if somebody's really starting to get to that level of maybe bothering and confronting and harassing her, that she wouldn't say something to somebody. So, and perhaps that's a part of the investigation, but I would, those are some of the things I would be looking for, an escalation in relationships, her personal relationships that are, escalating and becoming more problematic until this occurs. That's what I would expect to see, or I would be looking for.
What do you see the best thing that FindJodi, our team, can do, and the media in general, to keep Jodi's case out there? What role do you see that's perhaps been helpful or not helpful from your experience moving forward? We're talking 27 years, June 27th, since Jodi's been missing.
I do think that putting out as much information as possible, here's the person you're looking for, and it's hard to do when you don't have access to the files exactly, and you haven't reviewed it. But just putting out, continuing to put out as much information as possible, and potential offender characteristics, and see if anyone recognizes those characteristics in people that they know. And I think I've heard you say this, and I have said this myself: relationships change. They do. And you might not necessarily, like, I'm going to give an example. So in the kidnapping case that I mentioned earlier, the offender did not have a criminal history prior to or after. And a lot of people just described him as like, oh, he's a really nice guy, and no issues. And he didn't really have aspirations to have like a high-powered career or anything like that. But at the time he was arrested, he was living with a woman, and she didn't really have any issues with him at all. But he would not engage in he didn't want to have sexual relationship with her. Let's say somebody, you might not necessarily think that person is a rapist and a killer, but these are kind of the odd things. And so maybe if somebody hears that, like, okay, that might be a potential characteristic I should be looking for. And I know this person lived in Mason City during this time, or this person talked a lot about Jodi, or this person, and then you hear something like that. That is kind of odd, to be in a romantic relationship, and that your male partner doesn't want to have sexual relationship with you. It's kind of a red flag, but you might not recognize it as that. No one's going to just jump to the conclusion that this is a violent, rapist, killer. You just wouldn't jump to that. But sometimes it's those little details that you think, maybe. And sometimes all the investigators need is a name. Just give them a name of somebody. So, I put that out there, and I'm not saying that this is what this offender, what he would be like now or in the past, but, things like that, if a really, good profile was done on the case, and maybe you can put out some things they should be looking for, and the things that they should be looking for might not always be recognizable as problematic until you kind of put it into the context. So I hope that makes sense. So,
Julia, I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
Going off of what you just said, when you do a suspect behavioral analysis, you're providing it obviously to the law enforcement agency. Do you ever worry that you're going to be too right about certain things, or are there details so specific that might, spook the uncaught offender? When you give these recommendations, do you say, we recommend you might release these points, but keep these to yourself?
Yes, definitely. There are just certain things that you wouldn't want to tip off the offender. Like, for example, if you said something, well, they most likely have held on to trophies. So you don't want to put that out there because, although you might want to say, in the case of the Golden State Killer, like, release everything at this point. Maybe somebody in the past saw this class ring that was stolen that had an inscription on it. So we're careful to say, okay, in certain cases and depending on the situation, okay, you might want to release this, but you don't want to release that. The thing that I do get concerned about when, we say, okay, release this information or this, that you might be looking for this type of offender, is that some people just think, okay, it has to be that and only that. And they may think, so it can't be, my ex-boyfriend because he didn't do that exact thing, or he's not exactly like that. So you really have to caveat. It's like, these are what you may have noticed, or maybe this seemed odd to you, or so you have to be a little bit careful because people will get just like, okay, this person doesn't fit the exact profile that's been put out. So that's more of my concern, is that people they'll think too narrowly about it. Yeah.
You mentioned the possibility of this person being an unknown relationship to Jodi, and how if it were somebody closer, you would more expect to see escalation that would be noticeable to Jodi, obviously, and she would probably confide that escalation to other people. Could the same escalation principle apply to somebody who is that unknown relationship to her, where Jodi might only see some of the symptoms? And in that scenario, what would the profile be of this person, where the people around this person in the weeks, months, whatever it might be, leading up to the abduction, are there differences in that person's behavior if it's escalating and he's a stranger to her that others might see that Jodi only might see some of? If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Like, I think what you're asking is that if this is somebody who didn't have a close personal relationship to Jodi, more of an unknown offender, what would be their escalating patterns and characteristics?
What would his wife see or his coworkers see?
Yeah. Certainly, they might see the person talks about Jodi often and then maybe stops talking about her, or in the case that I referenced, this offender, he had been married at the time that this young woman was abducted, and they got a divorce. They went through a divorce within a year of the rape and murder, and she moved away. And she did report to police. She reported to she reported to the FBI in another state across the country that she thought her husband had killed this young woman because he talked about her. He had mentioned her. And so because she was having marital problems with him and he had talked about her, she thought he might be responsible. But nobody believed her because she was an alcoholic and had some mental health issues. Even her own family didn't believe her. And it turned out, all these years later, they had a tip early on. And to be fair, that happens a lot. Like a lot of, estranged wives and girlfriends will turn in, their boyfriends or husbands. But, she was very specific. He talked about that young woman. So you might, this person very well may have talked about Jodi to friends, family, even in passing. Like, I really liked the news, or he wanted to watch the news and seemed maybe a little overly obsessed. So you might see that. You might see unexplained absences during this time. Why is he gone? Again, if he lived with someone, you might have to make an excuse. People that worked with the person, did he miss work that day? Did he miss work other days and it was unusual? So you might see things like that. I would think that, if this is unknown and the person had this plan to abduct her, he's going to know where he's going to take her. So he'd have to have a place that was private and secure where he could do what he wanted without the risk of getting caught. So that's probably something he went and surveilled, or maybe it was a place that he was very familiar with through his employment or through recreation or, other ways. But I would think that, wherever her body may have been left or buried, this is an area that's familiar to the offender, and they'd been there before. So maybe visits to a certain area, that became more frequent. Oftentimes there are stressors involved. So this person may have had some sort of stressor, like I mentioned with Joe DeAngelo. Prior to him starting his killings, he had been fired as a police officer from his job, and that's when he escalated to murder. And so perhaps the offender had something significant, a significant stressor in their life, maybe the loss of a loved one or individual, or loss of employment or something else. So those are other things you might see.
Jodi's body not being found now after 27 years, aside from the organization that might show him pre-planning where to take her and what to do with her, is there anything else the lack of a body tells you possibly about a profile of Jodi's abductor?
I mean, sometimes bodies are just discarded in a remote area and there's no real attempt to hide them. And sometimes it's just by luck that they're found. And then there are other times offenders take a great deal of time to hide the bodies. And, when we talk about, profiling concepts and we say, okay, if somebody takes the time to hide a body, then they must have a closer relationship with that person. And if a person just discards a body, then they likely don't have as close a relationship, and it might just be haste, and they're not worried about being connected. And typically that's the case. Those are the scenarios. But we've seen, serial killers who have targeted people that are not known to them, can't be connected to them, and they take a lot of time to hide and bury their bodies. So, I really don't know. I would think that in this case, if it's a stranger or not a close personal relationship, this person had a place to take her and hide her so she couldn't be found. But it doesn't mean that they spent a lot of time trying to hide her. It could just be, it's just a remote enough area that her remains just, just because of, the lack of luck that somebody hasn't come across her. I really just don't know it. I'm really just speculating at this point.
Sure. If Jodi's risk in her victimology is because of her job, where she's on TV in front of 500,000 potential viewers, obviously widens the suspect pool, but would that manifest itself in any way from her public appearances or gifts sent to the TV station, or did this person try to interact with Jodi in a public setting or through gifts? Do you think that would make sense?
That's hard to say. I would think that would be a significant part of the investigation to see if anyone had contact with her, sent her gifts. I mean, when you're a public figure like that, erotomaniacs are out there, and oftentimes they do try to interact with somebody. So certainly that is a possibility, but you also might have the person that isn't going to spend that kind of time. And maybe what I would think is that if you had someone who kind of was a erotomaniac and felt maybe they had a relationship with her and were sending her gifts and things like that, you would see that behavior in other cases as well. You would see that this person had gotten fixated on other people, because they often do. So it doesn't mean this person wasn't fixated on her. It just means that they didn't express that in terms of trying to communicate with her. But if, in this case, if they did, I would expect to have seen that in potentially other cases, because people like that do tend to just have a fixation, and then, sometimes they move on to other fixations. You see that a lot with stalkers. So I would expect that, maybe, a good lead would potentially be reaching out to all of, the newscasters in the area and determine, okay, did you ever have weird interactions? And I would be surprised if that wasn't done. But, there's just so much that they would have to be doing. It's overwhelming because of the number of potential suspects. It's overwhelming. But yeah, certainly that would be a lead, is to try to determine, okay, has anyone else in this area or this viewing area been contacted or received gifts, and had Jodi received gifts or communications from, maybe a fan that seemed a little bit too into her. I would certainly look at that, but I don't think it's a guarantee.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it'd be worthwhile for anyone listening, or would it be, if, say, 6 months before the abduction, Jodi has an appearance at the Waffle Hut. This is a fictitious scenario. And someone's girlfriend or someone's brother or someone's roommate or friend is dragged to this event or knows he's going to that event. Would that be something that you're describing with this, or is it not necessarily inclusive in what happened to her?
Kind of refer back to this other case, and it's because the victims, in terms of their age and their, I don't want to say randomness, but just the forceful abduction, it just seems very similar to me. But this offender was obsessed with this young woman and had fantasies of abducting and raping women, and he did not communicate with her. As far as the investigation, he never had any communication with her or sent her things or anything. He observed her at her place of employment and sort of became fixated and fantasized about what he was going to do. And then, one night he did do it. So, oftentimes you can become obsessed and not have any prior communication in terms of letters and gifts or anything like that. If this victim had survived and you said, do you recognize this individual? She would probably say, yes, I do. He came into the store a couple of times, and that might be their sole interaction, and he became fixated on her. So that could just be the same with Jodi. Somebody sees her on TV, sees her at a function, and decides these are my fantasies, this is what I want to do, and they act on it, and there's no other interaction between them.
Well, that's helpful to me. I think that there are different kinds of fixations, and that obsession will manifest itself in different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to look like one thing.
These scenarios that we're talking about, when we talk about these types of offenders, are very fantasy driven, and the fantasies are so personal and they're varied. And so you just don't know. I mean, this person could have just had a fantasy, I want to kidnap somebody. And that was their fantasy, and they thought about it and ruminated about it. And maybe it went further than that. I want a fantasy, I have a fantasy and I'm going to take the person here, and this is what's going to happen. And so to really understand, none of these people behave exactly like we would expect them based on movies. I mean, there are certain characteristics they share. There are certain, actions that we see that might be similar in one case to another. But, this could very well be just a fantasy-based type of crime, as opposed to, a personal cause homicide. And personal cause homicide meaning somebody had a personal connection with her and had to kill her because of that. Something went wrong in that relationship. So if we're looking at the other scenario, we're looking at something that's probably very fantasy driven versus, personally driven because of, a prior known relationship that wasn't going well.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about was where this person might be from. He obviously lived in the area at the time. Well, did he? I mean, I say obviously, but because of her risk in the victimology of her being on TV, I guess I just assume he's within a 90-mile radius in the viewing area. And then where he might have left after, or did he leave? Is there anything from your insight, from your outside analysis of this case, that you can give us where this guy was, where he might be now?
But I would kind of go back to probabilities, and I would say he's most likely from the area, familiar with the area, and comfortable enough to commit this type of crime, this very high-risk crime in the area. And not only, because you probably have multiple scenes, but you have, the parking lot, and then you have wherever he took her, and maybe even another scene wherever he maybe disposed of her remains. So I think you most likely, have someone who is from the area, familiar with the area, was living in the area at the time. And a lot of times, you see what we call like post-offense behavior, and somebody, because of the scrutiny of law enforcement or attention to the case, or they become concerned about the investigation, they leave the area unexpectedly and with really no good reason or some excuse that they make up just to get out of the area. And that might be something that might ring a bell with somebody. That doesn't always happen. But I kind of feel that if and when the offender is identified and arrested and convicted, he's likely lived there and probably even still lives there. It's not 100%, but
can you say what that's based off of, probability wise? Because
of kind of the small area and the fact that this happened so quickly, and the offender got away very quickly. It was pretty efficient, and so that just probability wise, he's probably from the area. It's just less likely that he traveled from a great distance and came and got her. And then, how do you control someone when they're in your car unless she was killed right there at the scene in the parking lot, which I don't think that's the case. That's probably not what happened. But then he's got to take her a great distance away and controlling her in a car. So I would think that he grabbed her, maybe took her a few miles away, and again, it's kind of this, it's a familiarity with the area. So it's just, most likely he's just from the area. You kind of have to know your surroundings to commit a crime like that.
Sure. And
when I talk about probabilities, it's really that's just most likely what happened. But again, it could be someone who came from a great distance and wasn't familiar with the area and maybe stumbled upon her, or just thought, I'm just going to go here and see if I can find her. And then they do. I mean, that just becomes less plausible. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it becomes less plausible. And then somebody who's really familiar with the area, particularly if they've never been under investigation or felt any concern that they were a suspect, why leave? Why, they're probably, happy to stay there and live there. And there's no reason for them to leave. So I would think that they're probably, and statistically should still be alive. So they're probably still living in the area.
And that would be because they'd statistically be Jodi's age or close to Jodi's age?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I could really put an age range on it. I would say that in terms of this person, I mean, they're probably, I mean, the fact that they're physically confident, I would consider them to be, a grown adult male, and probably at least her age. But it's really difficult to put an age range on an offender. But at least someone who is an adult who is confident, and that does come with age. That confidence comes with being a little bit older. So without knowing more, I'm not sure I can just, describe any more in terms of their emotional maturity, but probably not super emotionally mature, probably not, someone who has made it really far in life in terms of being successful. So, people who do things like this and commit crimes like that tend not to be super successful because they're fixated. And I'm kind of talking this, maybe the stalker scenario. They get just too fixated on things, and they can't really, have a, really good job. They're too busy thinking and doing other things rather than concentrating on their work. What I'd just like to remind everyone is that, in terms of, conducting a detailed analysis, you can't really do it unless you see the actual case file and photographs and reports and talk with the investigators. And it's a group process. So, what we've talked about today is very much in general terms, and it's, it's not really as specific. And I've tried to apply like what I know and my background to what I believe that we can confidently say about the case, but there's just so much unknown. And I've heard you both say that so many times. There's just so much that's unknown. So, it's really hard, but that's what I just want to remind everybody, because, it's profiling is in no way an exact science, and it really is only, as effective as the information and the most accurate information you're provided. And, it's very collaborative. So I just want to remind everybody about that. But, I really do enjoy discussing cases and ideas and scenarios and with other people. I'm a huge true crime fan, and that's why I ended up in the career I ended up with. So I've really enjoyed the opportunity to come in and talk about this case, because it is a case that I have followed for many years. And so to get to just kind of talk it over with some people has been really very interesting for me as well. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your time. You came to the right place to talk Jodi's case over, that's for sure, because Caroline and I can do that all day. Real quickly, can you talk about your podcast in your own words and what listeners might get from that?
Oh, sure. So my podcast, it's called The Consult, and I do the podcast. I host it and such, but I have my former colleagues, Bob Drew, Susan Kostler, and Angela Surser. I worked with them in the behavioral analysis unit, and we discuss cases that are solved and unsolved, cases that we worked on, and we discuss the behavior in those cases, the behavior that is exhibited before, during, and after the commission of the crime. And it's really, obviously, really focused heavily on behavior. And I think I told you guys this before we started recording. It really is for the geekiest of the true crime fans out there, the most nerdy, because we get into really, detailed things about the behavior. And so, but that's what it is. And we call it The Consult. One of my colleagues, another colleague who's still with the FBI, came up with the name. And it's sort of this idea that when, we would review cases at the behavioral analysis unit and we were ready, we'd sit down with the investigators and we'd have a consultation, and we called them consults. So this is sort of the idea, and it's really like sitting there with us as we're talking through things, like what it was really like in the room when we were talking with people. And it's been really fun to go back over some cases and to highlight some cases with police departments that cases that remain unsolved. And we're going to have some detectives on our show to talk about cases that we worked on with them and what they found useful and what they didn't find useful. And then hopefully someday, maybe if any departments out there want to set another set of eyes to look at their case, where we do it for free. And we are also very cognizant of their investigation and not putting anything out there or talking about anything that they wouldn't want us to. They have complete control over everything, but it's a service that we will provide, and it's for free. And I always tell people it's not going to hurt anything. You can take it or leave it, but it's, again, just another set of eyes looking over a case. And it's a very unbiased review, because we're not involved in everything. We don't get emotionally attached the way these investigators do. This becomes sometimes their lives. So that's the idea, and it's called The Consult. And we have 13 episodes out. I thought, we'll try to do 10. And then we got to 13. And so now I'm thinking, well, maybe we'll try to get to 20, because there's a couple other cases we want to make sure to cover. So
you're never going to stop now. See?
Well, at some point we'll stop, but it was just really we want to try this. We want to, because we've all retired and we live in different places now. So this gives us an opportunity to kind of get the band back together and talk about things. And so we'll see where it goes, but we're going to try to get to 20 episodes, and maybe we'll do a few more. But this is a hobby. I mean, I also have a full-time job, and my colleagues are also have family commitments, and they're also working as well. So we're not totally retired. So it is quite a time commitment, as you both know, doing your podcast.
Just a bit,
well,
yeah.
And I've listened to several of their podcasts. I really recommend number 4, I believe it is. It's explaining the work of the Behavioral Analysis Unit. I learned a lot, and it's also very interesting. I think the first 3 parts are on the Golden State Killer case, but it's a really interesting educational experience, if you will.
Well, thank you. That's what we try. We try to dispel the myths, and we talk about the process and what profiling is and what it isn't. And we try to, as well, sort of expose these offenders for what they really are, truly what they are, and not what they're made out to be by media and TV and movies and things like that. Like really what truly drives them, motivates them, and what their real personality traits and characteristics truly are. So it's kind of like exposing them.
Well, Julia, thanks for lending your expertise and your experience to Jodi's case, if only from the outside. We greatly appreciate it. It's going to give us all a lot to think about and talk about. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
FindJodi is a nonprofit run by volunteers with a mission of keeping Jodi's unsolved case in the spotlight. Anyone with information about Jodi's case can reach out to the Mason City Police Department. Information can also be provided to the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations. You can also contact FindJodi anonymously if you prefer. Don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now. For the entire FindJodi team, I'm Scott Fuller. Thank you for listening.